There are mysteries that eventually find an answer. A missing person is found. A crime is solved. A question that haunted investigators for years finally makes sense. But then there are the cases that refuse to end. A house where someone vanished without leaving behind a single clear trace. A discovery so strange that investigators were forced to question what they thought they already knew. And a final case where the evidence seemed to prove that something had happened. But no one could explain exactly what. 3 mysteries. 3 sets of clues. And 3 stories where the most important question still has no definitive answer. The disturbing part isn't simply that these cases remain unsolved. It's that in each one, there is a moment when the evidence seems to point toward an explanation. Only for that explanation to fall apart. And tonight, we're going inside all 3. But the final mystery is the one that leaves behind the most uncomfortable question of all. What if the truth was there the entire time and investigators simply didn't recognize it? At first, each of these cases seemed like something investigators could explain. There was a logical theory. There was evidence. There were people who believed they knew what had happened. But then, one detail would surface. A detail that didn't fit. A detail that turned a simple explanation into something far more disturbing. And the deeper investigators looked, the stranger the cases became. Because the answers weren't simply missing. They seemed to be hiding somewhere inside the evidence itself. Tonight, we're going to examine 3 disturbing mysteries that were never completely solved. And with each story, we're going to get closer to the one thing these cases have in common. The moment when what investigators thought they knew stopped making sense. The first case begins with an ordinary situation. Nothing about it seemed unusual. Until someone disappeared. And when investigators arrived, they found something that would make the disappearance far more difficult to explain than anyone expected. Because the strangest clue wasn't what they found. It was what they didn't find. But before we get into what happened, there's one detail you need to know. Investigators initially believed they understood the situation. The evidence seemed to point in one direction. There was only one problem. One small detail didn't fit the story. And that detail would eventually become one of the biggest questions surrounding the entire case. Because if that detail means what some believe it means, then the disappearance may not have happened the way everyone originally thought. So let's go back to the beginning. To the last ordinary moments before everything changed. Mystery 1, the 3 lighthouse keepers who vanished. The Flannan Isles sit far off the western coast of Scotland. Small. Remote. Almost completely isolated from the mainland. And on one of those islands stood a lighthouse whose entire purpose was simple. Keep the light burning. In December 1900, 3 lighthouse keepers were stationed there. Their names were Thomas Marshall, James Duckett, and Donald MacArthur. They were experienced men. They knew the sea. They knew the island. And they knew how dangerous the weather could become. But nothing about their final days suggested that they were preparing to disappear. Then came the storm. And after that storm, all 3 men were gone. No bodies were ever recovered. No confirmed explanation was ever established. And what investigators found inside the lighthouse only made the mystery stranger. The lighthouse had been operating normally. The 3 men followed the routine expected of lighthouse keepers. They maintained the equipment. They watched the weather. They kept the light functioning. But on December 15th, a passing vessel reported something unusual. The lighthouse light was not visible. That was a serious problem. A lighthouse disappearing from view was not something that could simply be ignored. Days later, the relief vessel Hesperus approached the island. Its crew expected to see the lighthouse keepers waiting for them. They didn't. The ship sounded its horn. No response. They sent up signals. Still nothing. Eventually, the lighthouse keeper Joseph Moore went ashore to investigate. And what he found immediately told him something was wrong. The lighthouse was empty. Moore entered the building. The beds were unoccupied. The men were nowhere to be found. There was food and evidence of recent activity. But the three keepers themselves had disappeared. No obvious bodies. No obvious escape route. No clear explanation. Moore searched the island. Nothing. Then attention turned to the lighthouse's logbook. And this is where the story became disturbing. The entries described increasingly violent weather. Storms. Strong winds. Terrible conditions. The language suggested that the men believed the weather was becoming extremely dangerous. But there was something strange about those entries. The weather descriptions appeared to conflict with reports from elsewhere in the region. And that created a question. Were the keepers accurately describing what they were experiencing, or was something else happening on the island? Investigators examined the lighthouse itself. One of the most important clues was found at the landing area near the western side of the island. The area had suffered damage from powerful waves. Equipment had been displaced. A railing had been damaged. And objects had apparently been swept away. The official explanation would eventually focus heavily on the possibility of an enormous wave. The theory was simple. Perhaps one keeper went outside to secure equipment. A huge wave struck. The other two men went after him. And all three were swept into the sea. It was possible. But there was a problem. Why would all three men leave the safety of the lighthouse at roughly the same time? And why would experienced lighthouse keepers expose themselves to such conditions? The mystery wasn't solved. It had simply acquired a theory. There was another question. Why was the lighthouse left unattended? These men had one primary responsibility. Keep the light operating. Leaving the lighthouse during dangerous weather was extraordinarily risky. Yet somehow, all three men were gone. And there was no confirmed eyewitness account of what happened next. No one saw them leave. No one saw them fall. No one recovered their bodies. No final message explained their actions. The sea had simply swallowed the evidence. Or so it seemed. Over the years, countless theories appeared. Some suggested that a massive wave struck the lighthouse and swept the men away. Others imagined a struggle. Some theories became much darker, suggesting that one of the men may have killed the others before disappearing himself. There were even supernatural stories. But there is an important distinction. A mystery can generate hundreds of theories without producing a single verified answer. And that is exactly what happened here. The official investigation favored an accident involving the sea. But an official theory is not the same thing as knowing exactly what happened. Because no one could reconstruct the final moments with certainty. Imagine standing inside that lighthouse after the three men had disappeared. You can see their belongings. You can see the equipment they left behind. You know that three experienced men were there. And then suddenly, they weren't. No witnesses. No bodies. No definitive final account. Just an empty lighthouse facing an enormous ocean. And perhaps that's what makes the Flannan Isles mystery so unsettling. The island didn't hide the evidence. It left just enough evidence behind to make us believe there should be an answer. But not enough to tell us what that answer was. And there is one final question that remains. Did the sea take three men in a single catastrophic moment? Or did something happen inside that lighthouse before any of them ever reached the water? More than a century later. We still don't know for certain. But this was only the first mystery. Because the next case begins with something even stranger. A disappearance where the people who vanished seem to leave behind almost no explanation at all. The Flannan Isles mystery leaves us with a disturbing possibility. 3 men went missing. The sea may have taken them. But there is no final moment anyone can prove. No witness. No recovered bodies. No single piece of evidence that closes the case completely. And that's what makes the next mystery different. Because in the next case, investigators wouldn't be looking at an isolated lighthouse in the middle of the ocean. They would be looking at a disappearance surrounded by people, clues, and unanswered questions. And yet, the truth would prove just as difficult to find. Because sometimes, the strangest mystery isn't where someone went. It's why there was almost no trace that they had ever been there at all. The ocean can erase almost everything. Footprints. Evidence. Even entire lives. But our next mystery has nothing to do with the open sea. It begins somewhere completely different. With an ordinary place, ordinary people, and a disappearance that should have been easy to explain. Except it wasn't. Because when investigators began reconstructing what happened, they discovered that the timeline itself didn't seem to make sense. Mystery 2, the disappearance that shouldn't have been possible. At first, there was nothing mysterious about the day. Everything appeared normal. People went about their routines. Nothing seemed unusual. And then, sometime between one ordinary moment and the next, someone disappeared. There was no dramatic warning. No confirmed struggle. No clear explanation. Just an absence. At first, everyone assumed the person would return. Maybe they had gone somewhere. Maybe there had been a misunderstanding. Maybe there was a perfectly ordinary explanation. But as the hours passed, that explanation became harder to believe. Because there was one problem. The last known movements didn't make sense. The last confirmed sighting placed the missing person at location. According to verified source evidence, they were seen at approximately time. Nothing about the moment immediately suggested danger. And that detail matters. Because if something terrible had happened, there should have been some indication. A witness. A sound. A struggle. A vehicle. Something. Instead, there was almost nothing. And the less investigators found, the more questions appeared. Authorities began searching the obvious places. Nearby roads. Buildings. Vehicles. Areas the person was known to visit. Friends and relatives were questioned. The timeline was reconstructed minute by minute. And slowly, investigators began narrowing down the final known hours. But instead of making the case clearer, the timeline made it stranger. One event appeared to happen before another. But according to verified evidence, that sequence was difficult or impossible to reconcile. Something wasn't adding up. Then investigators found key clue. At first, it looked insignificant. Just another piece of evidence. But when investigators compared it with the established timeline, something changed. The clue suggested what it actually indicates. And that created a disturbing possibility. If the clue was genuine, then the original timeline might be wrong. And if the timeline was wrong, then investigators might have been searching in the wrong direction from the beginning. Investigators considered primary theory. On the surface, it made sense. It explained fact 1. It could explain fact 2. And for a while, it seemed like the most reasonable explanation. But then came the problem. Contradictory fact. That single detail didn't fit. And once investigators tried to explain it, another question appeared. Why would person even happen if the original theory was correct? There was no easy answer. Behind all the evidence was a person who had suddenly vanished. Someone had a routine. People who knew them. Plans for the future. A normal life that was interrupted without warning. And for the people left behind, uncertainty became its own kind of punishment. Because a confirmed tragedy can eventually be understood. A disappearance is different. Every unanswered possibility remains alive. Every phone call could be the one that changes everything. Every unidentified sighting could be the missing piece. And every year that passes makes the silence harder to understand. Then came second verified CLUE. It appeared to support one explanation. But there was another way to interpret it. And this is where the mystery becomes complicated. The same evidence could point in two completely different directions. Possibility 1, Theory A. Possibility 2, Theory B. Both explain some of the evidence. Neither explains all of it. And that's the problem. A mystery becomes truly difficult when every answer creates another question. There are several possibilities. Perhaps Theory A is correct. Perhaps Theory B explains the unexplained timeline. Or perhaps an overlooked detail connects everything in a way investigators have never established. But there is one thing we cannot honestly say. We cannot say we know. Because there is no definitive evidence proving one explanation beyond reasonable doubt. And without that final piece, the case remains open to interpretation. Years can pass. Evidence can disappear. Memories can change. Witnesses can forget details. And yet the central question remains exactly the same. What happened during those missing moments? Because somewhere inside that gap in the timeline, there may be an explanation, a decision, a meeting, a crime, an accident, or something investigators haven't considered. We simply don't know. And that uncertainty is what makes this mystery so disturbing. But the final case is different. Because in that mystery, the evidence doesn't simply disappear. It appears to tell a story. The problem is, no one can agree on what that story means. Two mysteries. Two disappearances surrounded by unanswered questions. But the second case leaves us with something even more disturbing than a missing person. It leaves us with a gap in the story. A period of time where something happened. But we may never know exactly what. And if you think that is unsettling, wait until you hear the final case. Because this time, investigators didn't simply have a missing person and conflicting clues. They had evidence. They had a timeline. They had something that appeared to tell them exactly what had happened. There was just one problem. The evidence didn't agree with itself. The first mystery left us with an empty lighthouse. The second left us with a timeline that refused to make sense. But the final mystery is different. Because this time, the evidence seems to tell a story of its own. The problem is, no one can agree on what that story means. And the deeper investigators looked, the more disturbing the case became. So let's go back to the beginning. To the moment when the first clue was discovered. Mystery 3, the evidence that didn't make sense. The first clue looked ordinary. Almost too ordinary to matter. Investigators had no reason to believe it would become important. But then another clue appeared. And another. Soon. These small pieces began forming a pattern. At first, the pattern seemed obvious. Something had happened. The evidence appeared to point toward a single explanation. But the closer investigators looked, the less certain that explanation became, because one piece of evidence contradicted another. And when investigators tried to build a timeline around what they had found, there was a gap that nobody could explain. The story begins on date in location. Before that day, people had been living an apparently ordinary life. There was nothing obvious to suggest that anything was about to go wrong. Then, at approximately time, event happened. That moment would later become the starting point of the investigation. At first, authorities believed the explanation would be straightforward. They were wrong. Investigators discovered key evidence. It immediately raised questions. Why was it there? Who had left it? And most importantly, what did it mean? The evidence appeared to point toward initial theory. For a brief period, investigators had a working explanation. Then they discovered something that didn't fit. Contradictory evidence. Suddenly, the original theory became much harder to defend. Investigators began reconstructing the final known hours. At time, event. At time, event. At time, event. The sequence appeared straightforward. Until investigators reached critical moment. That was where the timeline broke down. Something should have happened. But there was no reliable evidence showing that it did. And something else appeared to have happened, without anyone being able to establish exactly how. This created the central question of the case. What happened during those missing moments? Investigators examined everything they could. Physical evidence, witness statements, records, locations, possible movements. And each new piece of information seemed to answer one question while creating another. CLUE1 suggested interpretation. But CLUE2 suggested something completely different. Then came CLUE3. And that clue was particularly disturbing. Because if it was interpreted correctly, it meant the original theory could not explain what happened. Investigators initially believed Theory A. It was reasonable. It explained several important facts. But it couldn't explain contradiction. So another possibility emerged. Theory B. This explanation solved one problem, but created another. Because if Theory B were correct, then investigators had to explain new problem. It became a frustrating cycle. Every possible answer created another unanswered question. Eventually, investigators and observers began considering a much darker possibility. Theory C. If true, it would mean consequence. But there was no definitive evidence proving it. And that distinction matters. A disturbing theory is not the same thing as a proven fact. The evidence may allow the possibility. It does not necessarily establish the truth. And that is exactly why this case remains so difficult. Years later, one particular detail continues to attract attention. Most important verified detail. Some believe it supports theory. Others argue that it can be explained by alternative explanation. Neither interpretation completely closes the case. And without the missing evidence, there may be no way to know which interpretation is correct. We know Fact 1. We know Fact 2. We know Fact 3. But we do not know Central Unknown. And that distinction is important, because mysteries often become distorted over time. Rumors become facts. Theories become stories. And speculation becomes part of the legend. But when we strip all of that away, we are left with the evidence. And the evidence still doesn't give us a complete answer. Maybe the explanation is ordinary. Maybe one overlooked detail connects everything. Maybe someone knew the answer and took it with them. Or maybe the evidence has been misunderstood for decades. We simply don't know. And perhaps that is the most disturbing part. Not that the case contains no clues, but that it contains just enough clues to make us believe an answer should exist. 3 mysteries. 3 investigations. 3 different sets of unanswered questions. And in every case, the same uncomfortable possibility remains. The truth may be hidden somewhere inside the evidence, but we may never know how to see it. After looking at all 3 mysteries, one thing becomes clear. The most disturbing part isn't that there are no clues. There are clues. There are timelines. There are witness accounts, physical evidence, theories, and investigations. What is missing is something much more important. Certainty. In the first mystery, the evidence suggests what may have happened, but no one can prove the final moments. In the second, the timeline contains unanswered gaps that leave multiple possibilities open. And in the third, the evidence appears to tell a story, but different interpretations lead to completely different conclusions. That's what makes these cases so difficult. A mystery doesn't remain unsolved because there is absolutely nothing to investigate. Sometimes it remains unsolved because there is too much evidence pointing in different directions. And that leaves us with an uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps the answer has always been somewhere inside these cases. Perhaps one overlooked detail could connect everything. Or perhaps the missing piece disappeared long ago. The people who knew the truth may be gone. The evidence may have been lost. And the moments that mattered most may never have been witnessed. So after all these years, we are left with theories, but not certainty. And that distinction is exactly what separates a solved case from a mystery. Because sometimes the most frightening question isn't, what happened? It's this: what if we never get the chance to know? Maybe the answers to these mysteries are simpler than we imagine. Maybe they are buried somewhere in an overlooked piece of evidence. Maybe someone, somewhere, knows exactly what happened. Or maybe the truth disappeared with the people who witnessed it. But after all these years, one question remains. If the evidence is all we have left, how do we know when the evidence is telling us the truth? And perhaps that's what makes these mysteries so disturbing. Not knowing what happened is frightening. But knowing that an answer may exist, and realizing we may never be able to prove it, is even worse. Some mysteries eventually find their answers. Others simply become part of history. But the 3 cases we've explored tonight remind us that not every question gets a satisfying ending. Sometimes the evidence survives. Sometimes the stories survive. But the truth disappears. And perhaps somewhere, hidden inside an old record, an overlooked photograph, or a forgotten memory, the final piece of one of these mysteries is still waiting to be found. Until then, we can only follow the clues and wonder what really happened. If you enjoy mysteries that leave more questions than answers, subscribe for more. Because the next mystery may be even harder to explain.